seminar on addressing literacy through neuroscience with Dr. Martha Burns. I trust that you will be finding the session informative. We had Martha with us 2 years ago when we did some full-day trainings with speech language pathologists and teachers, and it was extremely well received. So I do hope that you will find that this afternoon session will be valuable to you. Before I go on and pass the stage to Dr. Burns, I would like to introduce the sponsors and organizers for this event. My name is Cheryl. I'm actually from BrainFit, and BrainFit is one of the organizers of the event, together with Scientific Learning Corporation from the US. So a little bit more about BrainFit. BrainFit Group has two learning centers branch under its umbrella. So one's BrainFit Studio. So at BrainFit Studio, by being BrainFit, we really mean having good cognitive skills in the area of attention, processing speed, as well as memory. Right. So at BrainFit Studio is an outfit that therapists like myself, psychologists and teachers, we all work intensively with building brain fitness in students. And so we don't offer content instruction. All right. It's really a training program that helps to build cognitive skills that Dr. Burns is going to talk a little bit more about. So the neuroscientific aspects of that. And so by BrainFit, being BrainFit, it means being able to think faster, read faster, focus longer, etc. And we do have another, before I move on to the other outfit. So BrainFit Studio, we have 3 centers in Singapore right now. We started out at Novena, so we have another center, 2 centers, one in East Coast and one in Serangoon Gardens. We are also in the region. We are in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Bangkok and the Philippines. So wherever we are, we do the same thing. We intensively train the students that we work with in the area of cognitive skills. So we have another outfit, which is BrainFit Classroom. So at BrainFit Classroom, we have content instruction. And so it's more like your tuition, enrichment center, where the one subject that we focus on is English. So we teach grammar and vocabulary and comprehension skills and strategies and writing skills, and at the same time using some brain fitness training techniques as well. So if you ever see us, you hopefully know what's the difference between that. So if you want to know more about brain fitness and certainly the work that we do, our book, Quick Brains Learn Better, has just been released. So we welcome you to learn a little bit more about the work that we've been doing over the last 12 years. So we have been around since 2001. So quite a few stories that we have to share. And in the course of our work, about 10 years ago, I think about 2003, we got acquainted with a company called Scientific Learning in the US. So Scientific Learning is really the brainchild of 4 scientists. So Dr. Bill Jenkins and Dr. Michael Mersnick, they are really the experts in the area of neuroplasticity. So these gentlemen have spent many years of their lives looking at how to wire up the brain, how to make use of neuroplasticity, what are the conditions where a brain can be accelerated in its rewiring and reorganization so that we have a better brain. And that is, so they had a collaboration with Dr. Paula Talal and Dr. Stephen Miller, who are actually experts in the area of language and literacy development. So they came together to look at, can we apply neuroscientific tools and build the conditions, whereby we can wire up a brain for better language and literacy development. And this is, Dr. Burns will be sharing with us a lot more about that. She's the expert in this field. And so the products that currently is delivered through Scientific Learning, there are 2. One's Fast Forward and the other one's Reading Assistant. And the 2 products really aim to accelerate, the ultimate goal is really comprehension, be it oral, verbal comprehension as well as print comprehension, by working through phonics, phonological and phonemic awareness, vocabulary, fluency, and then comprehension. These products, especially Reading Assistant, we are currently offering it in about 10 schools in Singapore, so it's still quite new. But I had a very nice encounter a couple of weeks ago when I was doing teacher training, and this was the Reading Assistant product at one of the primary schools. So the teacher turned to me and said that, we really need to get this program up and running. So I said, is there some urgency? She said, yeah, my students are begging me to start working on the program. So they had run this program last year. And so I thought it was really delightful, to be able to hear that, kids are really eager to come and now work on something that's going to build their brains and at the same time improve literacy. And this my personal passion, with the area of neuroscience is exactly that. Because from neuroscience we know that can every child become motivated and successful? The answer is probably yes. But if we pitch learning at the right level, often the challenge is that you have a class of 20, maybe 30, maybe 40 students. You have one teacher. Every brain is different. Now, how are we going to deliver content and curriculum, so that everyone can learn? I mean, some kids might be at the right level, so that's okay for them. Other kids might find it boring if they're ahead, or might find it challenging if they're struggling. So I think with neuroscience and the tools that we now have, I think it's really encouraging to be able to hear feedback like that because with computer technology and Reading Assistant does exactly that, after an evaluation, the kids are able to really access books that is just at their level. Right? So learning can become individualized and kids can see more successes. So incidentally, BrainFit, we were also awarded the Best International Value Added Representative from Scientific Learning last year again. And now I have to introduce my speaker, my wonderful speaker for this afternoon. So in January, there was a Cognitive Science Connect conference. And so this was a statement made by our Minister of Education, Mr. Heng Swee Keat. So he said there's lessons from the field of cognitive science, studying how our brains work could help to improve how children learn. And we know this to be true. So neuroscience is really shedding light on how learning takes place. And Dr. Burns is certainly going to be sharing with us about this important topic this afternoon. So we're really looking forward to learning about that. A little bit more about Dr. Martha Burns. She has been a practicing speech-language pathologist in the USA for more than 35 years now. I was told quite a lot more. She serves on the faculty of Northwestern University and is on the medical staff of Evanston Northwestern Hospital in Illinois, Chicago. So Dr. Burns is a fellow of the American Speech-Language Hearing Association, and she has received lots of honors from Northwestern University, Evanston Hospital Corporation, the American Speech-Language Hearing Foundation, and also St. Xavier University. Dr. Burns is a distinguished author of many journal articles, books, as well as a language assessment. So without taking up any more time, let's welcome Dr. Martha Burns.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's wonderful to be here. She'll get the slides up and then we will get started. So while Cheryl's getting them up, I'd just love to get a feeling for how many of you do what. How many of you are actually teachers? Oh, quite a few of you. Okay, and then any speech and language pathologists here? Or psychologists? Or occupational therapists? Okay. Physical therapists? Did I leave anybody out? Okay. So, yeah, what we're going to be talking about now is neuroscience. So I'm going to be updating you on neuroscience and how it applies to literacy and what we do with advancing literacy as professionals. So this slide is actually taken from the journal Science. The journal Science had a special issue about a year and a half ago on what they called the new science of learning. So I borrowed their terminology and borrowed this slide from them. And what the new science of learning special issue is all about, and you can access that online if you wanted, is this idea that in addition to curriculum, which of course every country has really spent probably every industrialized country has spent the last probably 10 to 15 years trying to standardize their curriculums, trying to make sure that if a child moves to Singapore from another region in Malaysia, or if a child moves from Singapore to Hong Kong, that generally speaking will have some continuity within the country, of course, but then also between countries that have students going back and forth. And in the United States, we've done the same thing. We've tried to get our curriculum to be well standardized and what they call a common curriculum or a core curriculum, so that if a child moves from one part of the United States to another part of the United States and they're in year 2, that the academic standards and the academic expectations would be the same no matter what school they went to. And I like to refer to that as the what of teaching. That is, of course, the content. That's what we expect children to have accomplished each year of school, and all of the mastery that goes into that. But the new science of learning goes 3 steps further. the first step it goes is to add psychology. And when we're adding psychology, we're adding the expertise that the psychologist gives us in being able to assess strengths, learning strengths, or cognitive strengths and weaknesses of children so that we can identify children who might be at risk for reading problems, especially, and our topic today is literacy, or children who might be at risk for other kinds of learning issues. And psychologists have been doing this for a long time. That's what educational psychologists do, is they do assessments of children. They help us to understand the child's overall intellectual capacity, but also their individual cognitive and learning strengths and weaknesses. Now, what's added to this that's new is these two blocks here. The first one being neuroscience. The field of neuroscience didn't even exist until the mid to late 1990s. There was no field of neuroscience. We had subfields, if you will. We had neuropsychology, we had cognitive psychology, we had neuroanatomy, we had the medical field of neurology, studying illness and injury. But there was no overarching scientific discipline to cover all of those areas. In 1995, technology was developed called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which you're probably all very familiar with, because we can almost once a month or something, you can pick up a magazine like Time magazine or any of your newspapers here in Singapore, and they might have a special issue on the brain, and the brain doing something, the brain in music, or the brain in when you sleep. And almost always they show pictures of the brain at work with fMRI. Prior to fMRI, what we had to see the brain at work was either EEG, which was very gross measure of the brain, because with EEG you're measuring electrical activity, but you're measuring electrical activity as it's averaged across the brain and through the scalp and the skull. So an EEG is a very gross measure of electrical activity in the brain. We can get finer measures now than we used to be able to with things like evoked cortical testing, but it still didn't give us a very good picture of the parts of the brain that children used. In the 1980s, we had PET scanning available. That was the first time you could actually see a picture of the brain at work, if you will. But PET scanning involved injection or inhalation of radiation, of radioactive material, so it was not used very often because of the radiation dose exposure. It was used with people who were sick or for whom the radiation wouldn't be that much of a risk. But with fMRI, that opened up a whole new world, because anyone there is no morbidity to fMRI. There's nothing dangerous that anyone has ever determined. You're just subjecting your body to a magnetic field, and it's just taking a picture essentially of what's called the Bold signal. The Bold signal is blood oxygenation level, which means, and all that means is that blood, when it carries oxygen in it, has a different magnetic force than blood that doesn't have oxygen. So the oxygen in blood gives it a different magnetic readout. So if you're reading a magnetic picture of your body, regions where the blood flow doesn't have oxygen in the brain are regions that were just used by the brain, and you can pick that up and you get this very nice view of the parts of the brain that were used to do something. And we could do that with children on the autism spectrum. We can do that with children with dyslexia. You're going to see those slides. We can do that with adults who are typical or non-typical in terms of one capacity or another. We can look at professional musicians and see how their brain processes music differently than someone like you or I. So it just opened up this whole new world. And with that came this field then of neuroscience, this umbrella field. And then at about the same time, in the early 1990s and mid-1990s, we had the advent of technology and artificial intelligence. And there was a huge push, and I bring that up here because Singapore was one of the major countries that was involved in a lot of the artificial intelligence research. There's a lot in Asian countries going on in artificial intelligence. And that ushered in this whole ability to utilize technology to understand learning and to facilitate learning and to augment learning and to accelerate learning. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to be talking primarily about the neuroscience component and the technology component. So since all of you are educators and you work with children with special needs in one capacity or another, I know you all have had a neurology course, so I'm not going to spend too much time on neurology, but since we're going to be looking at fMRIs, I just want to go over a few things with you, and some of it may be new for you, a little bit new for you. This is a slide taken from Stanislas Dehaene's book. He's a neuroscientist whose specialty is reading and math, and this is from his book, Reading in the Brain, which you can order online. You can get it at Amazon.com and download it to your Kindle if you want, or your Nook. But you can also get all of his slides like this on his website, which is readinginthebrain.org. So if you wanted to download any of them, you could. And I like his because his emphasis is the reading brain, and so he shows you the parts of the brain that are essential for reading. And what you're going to see then is we're going to be able to look at fMRI scans of children who are reading easily and children who are struggling in reading, and you'll be able to tell the difference between the two and feel pretty comfortable with that. So, as you all know, the brain is divided into 4 lobes. The back 3 lobes are sensory, of course. The parietal lobe is getting information in from your body, from body senses of both skin and joints. So it's getting information in on position in space and movement as well as touch. The occipital lobe is getting information in from our eyes, so it is the visual part of our brain. And then the temporal lobe is getting information in, sensory information in from our ears, as long as we aren't deaf. And the occipital lobe, as long as we aren't blind. One of the amazing things about the human brain is it's so plastic that if a child is blind or becomes deaf, the neurons in the temporal lobe or occipital lobe don't go away, but they're recruited by the other senses. So when you look at fMRIs of people who are blind, you will see that their occipital lobe neurons are lighting up when they're listening and feeling things. And they actually have more neurons devoted to the other 2 senses. So they actually feel better manually and listen better than the rest of us who have eyes. So there's a big debate in the US among deaf people whether they should get cochlear implants because they have better sense of touch and better sense of vision than people who are hearing. And so there's a big argument about whether cochlear implants are good or not good. So I won't get into that. So those are the sensory lobes. And then, as you know, we have one lobe that enables us to act on the world, and that's the frontal lobe. And the back of the frontal lobe is about movement, the motor strip and the premotor strip. But everything in front of this line right here is prefrontal cortex. And prefrontal cortex is executive functions, attention, and cognitive control, and social skills, essentially, taking the perspective of others. So prefrontal cortex is continuing to mature, I think, in all of your brains. It continues to mature until we're in our 50s, prefrontal cortex, and then kind of a sad thing happens. Somewhere around your 52nd or 53rd birthday, which is it starts to go the other direction. All right, but we're hoping in neuroscience that we'll find a solution to that. And especially we're hoping that if you're my age, trust me. All right, so those are the lobes, of course, you know. Now, the areas of the brain, the landmarks that are so important for reading, I just want to go over with you quickly. The first one, I'm going to start with the most advanced first, and that is where these 3 sensory lobes come together. So where the occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and parietal lobe join, there's an angle that's formed. You can see it's a bump. And a bump in Latin, of course, is gyrus. So it's called the angular gyrus. The angular gyrus is essential for integration of vision and sound, or vision and parietal sense, or sound and parietal sense. And so that is the part of our brain, along with the parts of the supramarginal gyrus, next to it, and supramarginal just means above the margin of the sylvian fissure. So the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus combined process symbols. And they process any symbols, whether you're talking about music, which is an auditory visual symbol where you have to integrate auditory and vision, or reading, where you have to integrate auditory and vision, the auditory sound of the word with the letter, if it's an alphabetic language. If it's an ideographic language like Chinese or Japanese, it's the visual image integrated with the word. And it doesn't depend as much on sound as the alphabetic languages do, but it still does. But all symbol systems, if you're talking about athletics and you're talking about a soccer match, all those X's and O's are symbols for plays. So students have to be able to process those X's and O's, and they have to translate them into body sense, in the sense of their body and movement, but also the sense of space, which is visual. So even being a soccer coach or a football coach means that you're going to be dealing with symbol systems. And symbol systems, of course, are essential for mathematics, and in mathematics you're linking the body sense with, because mathematics, the number sense is body, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later if you want, but linking it with the visual numeral. So that's the part of the brain that starts to mature at around 5 years of age. And at 5 years of age, then, is when, for the most part, around the world, we introduce the first symbol systems for reading and mathematics. All right? And some cultures and some countries go a little lower to 4 years of age, and some start a little bit later, but that's about the time that you start that, and that's because that's the time when that part of the brain is ready to handle symbol systems. It's ready to integrate, because the primary sensory systems are mature. Now, the primary sensory systems that you have to read, and this is on literacy, so we're going to stress that, are these two. The top bump of the temporal lobe, which is just the superior temporal gyrus, right over here, is the part of the brain that becomes mapped for the phonemes of alphabetic languages. Okay? So languages that have phonemes embedded in the words depend upon this superior temporal gyrus to become mapped for those sounds. So in English, it's going to be mapped for p and k and d and g and j and all of that. And then the other area you have to have for literacy, well mapped and mature before you can teach a child to read, is right down here. And it's referred to, DeHaan refers to it as the visual word form area. And that's a part of the brain that recognizes letters and then recognizes words once individual letters have been recognized. So that's the part of the brain that you use to recognize the word cat or any word that's familiar that you can get as a whole word all at once, okay? And that, both of these regions, the superior temporal gyrus, but especially the visual word form area, take about 4 to 5 years to fully mature. So language is intact, and the temporal lobe language areas are fully mature around 4 to 5, and so is the visual word form area. But doesn't mean children don't make mistakes, because those areas will continue to mature a little bit, really till 7 and 8. But those are the important parts of the brain for recognizing letters and numbers and handling symbols. Now the last part I want to emphasize is right here. The inferior frontal region. If there are any speech pathologists in the room, you know that is Broca's area. And that's in the left hemisphere. By the way, all of these are in the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere superior temporal gyrus does other things. It doesn't handle speech sounds. And the right hemisphere visual word form area is not a visual word form area. It's actually called the facial fusiform gyrus, and it recognizes faces and objects. So we have this symbolic center, we have these two sensory centers, and then in the frontal lobe we have the inferior frontal gyrus, or inferior frontal area, Broca's area. Only in the left hemisphere does it do the following. The inferior frontal area is what you use to talk. So we know that adults who have strokes in Broca's area have what's called a Broca's aphasia, and they have trouble talking, an expressive aphasia. But it also sequences. It sequences fine motor behaviors of any kind. So it's used to sequence movements in using tools. So Broca's area is the part of the brain we use to do something like use a scissors and be able to cut. We use Broca's area if you were going to use a bow and arrow to hunt. Women who, or men if they wanted to, who sew with a needle and thread, use Broca's area. So for the most part, when you talk about fine motor skills, especially when you're talking about sequencing of fine motor skills, whether you're talking about it for speech or whether you're talking about it for tool use, you are involving Broca's area. And it always involves a sequence. And if children are struggling with sequencing movements in speech, you will know it because they'll say things like evelator for elevator or aminal for animal, okay? And they'll get syllables mixed up and sounds mixed up until that area is mature. Now, this inferior frontal region is also important for a couple of other things. It's important for word retrieval. So if we were talking this morning with a parent who wanted to know whose child is having trouble with mathematics and he's having trouble with his multiplication facts. Well, often when children have trouble with mathematics, especially if it's math facts, what they are having trouble doing is recalling the fact quickly. So if they sit and think about it, they can do the math behind 7 times 3. They can go, well, wait, 7 times 2 is 14, so if I add 7 to 14, it would be 21. But what they're having trouble doing is retrieving those math facts quickly and easily. And that slows them down when they're doing math problems tremendously. And that's why people want them to know facts and be able to retrieve them quickly. So it's very important for word retrieval. It's very important for verbal fluency. So speaking quickly and easily, and the way we measure verbal frequency, our psychologist here knows, is you ask someone to name animals in a minute. How many animals can you name in a minute? And if somebody has good verbal fluency, they should be able, depending on their age, to name 10 or 15 animals pretty quickly. And if they have trouble, they start, you say, name as many animals as you can. Start with dog, child goes dog, cat, elephant, tiger, wolf, pig, cow, elephant, zebra, oops, I said elephant, zebra, fish, rat, and they keep going. If a child has trouble with verbal fluency, you really know it, because they'll say dog, cat, did I say dog? Dog. Let me think. Puppies, puppy. And those kids who have trouble with verbal fluency often have trouble with reading fluency. And they also often have trouble with mathematics and retrieving math facts. So that's a part of the brain that's shared for lots of those different kinds of capacities. And so we want to look at those areas when we're looking at and trying to understand literacy and trying to understand the relationship between language and literacy, which takes me to our next slide. On our next slide, what you have is the first fMRI scan that we had. It's done by Joy Hirsch at Columbia University, and it was the first fMRI slide we have of the brain at work, in this case thinking of names of words. So it's 35 adults just like you, and you have a huge university hospital here that does fMRI, so you could all volunteer if you wanted tomorrow morning to be in an fMRI experiment, and you could get an fMRI scan like this and hang it on your living room wall, and at your next party say, oh yes, this is me. Just thinking of words. Okay, so, or whatever they wanted you to do. But this was the first one done. You can see it was published in 2001, which is just a little over 10 years ago. And it was 35 typical adults, just like you and me, who were asked to think of names of objects. And they saw pictures of objects, and they heard objects making noise like a bell ringing, and they felt objects. And every time they felt or heard or saw an object, they pressed a button when they knew what the name was. And then they took a picture of this bold signal in their brain every time they thought of the name of something. They averaged it across the 35 individuals in these thousands of names they thought of, and this is what they came up with. So this is what we call the object naming network. All of these regions are involved when you're thinking of the name of something. And what we know about networks in the brain is that these neurons are firing at the same rhythm. So we call that the Hebbian axiom for Hebb, who in the 50s said, neurons that fire together wire together. But what we know when we see a network is that these neurons, these clumps of neurons, are firing together synchronously, and they are joined together by a long axonal fiber track. And that fiber track and that network matures over time. And the key to understanding, we now know in neuroscience, the key to understanding learning disabilities or children who are struggling to learn is that often a part of a network is weak and it isn't contributing or it hasn't matured adequately. And the nice thing about that is the brain is plastic. So once you can identify where processing is weak, let's say it's the superior temporal gyrus, and I know that what the superior temporal gyrus does is perceive speech sounds, then it's pretty simple to go in and do an intervention technologically where you build up the ability to perceive speech sounds accurately, and then you repair the network and the child's off and running. So that's kind of in a nutshell what neuroscience is all about. Now this was the same study, still Joy Hirsch at Columbia, and this was the same group of 35 adults, and in this case they were computing integers. So this was a computation view of the brain, the computation network, and what I want you to see is the overlapping parts of the brain. So what you see is the inferior frontal region here, just like you did with the naming network. Because computation involves sequencing. I mean, you all know with math that if you have parentheses, if you have 4 plus 2 in a parentheses times 3, that's 6 times 3. That's 18. That's very different than 4 times 2 plus 3, right? Which is 4 times 5, which is 20. And it all depends on the sequence of those parentheses. So really, mathematics is no different than language sequences. And because of that, and because we need to retrieve and sequence, that same inferior frontal region is involved as much with a math network as it is with a language network. You also see the angular gyrus here. So that's the inferior parietal lobe is the angular gyrus, angular supramarginal gyrus, and that's the symbol center. So in any symbol, you're going to see that as being part of the network. And then finally, the only real difference with math and language is you involve the right parietal lobe. And why would you involve the parietal lobe? Well, because math is a body sense. So math, when it starts out in the brain, is all relative to you and your body in space. So the difference between big and small concepts of size, which is one numerical concept, has to do with you. If it's bigger than me, it's big. If it's smaller than me, it's small. If, in the beginning, if it's near and far, if it's far away from me, if it's near to me. So even if we're measuring distance in meters and centimeters, it's relative to me first. And when children first start with concepts of number, they count on their fingers. And when human beings first started counting, they counted on their fingers. So if you ask a 3-year-old, how old are you? They almost always say, oh, I'm 3. I'm 3. Now my little sister over there, she's 2. She's little. But I'm 3 and I'm going to be 4 in a month. This many. Okay? So numerical concepts start out as body sense. What's the very first word that a little child learns, the first adjective? More. More candy. More milk. So number it relates to the child and the child's own body at first, and that's why it's in the parietal lobe probably. I mean, it would make sense. So the number sense then and computation is just kind of this symbol language center of the left hemisphere and the parietal body sense on top of that. Now, just finally, before we get involved in actually looking at some of these scans and actually seeing what we've learned as neuroscientists, just to remind you, the 3 things that those of you who are teachers, do every day to build brains. And to do that, I just want to review for you how the brain builds itself. Okay? It starts out with a genetic code. All of the neurons, you're seeing 3 neurons here, all of the neurons of the brain have all your genes in them. And so the first part of brain development is driven by the genes. And the genes are going to determine how the long arms of neurons, how the axons, grow, where they start and where they finish. And so the long fiber tracts of the brain are generally driven by genes and genetic codes, and they're laid down pretty much early in life, and their structure is genetically determined. One of the things we've learned from neuroscience recently, some research by WASS, W-A-S-S, is that autism spectrum disorder is a disorder which in part involves the laying down of long fiber tracts. So for years and years and years, we're trying to figure out what is making the brain of a child on the autism spectrum different. We know it's different because of their behavior, but we couldn't find lesions. We couldn't find areas of the brain where neurons were any different. Perhaps a little bit in the cerebellum, but even that was questionable because it might have been the cerebellar neurons changed by the time these adults died and just kind of atrophied. But what we can now see with something called DTI, which is diffusion tensor imaging, and it enables us to see fiber tracts, is that the long fiber tracts of the brain in children on the spectrum are very immature. Their short fiber tracts develop on time, but the long fiber tracts don't. And that's driven by genetic blueprint that the brain has to lay out the highways of the brain. And that genetic blueprint, something's interrupting that in the development of children on the spectrum. So what teachers do then is they don't actually create these long fiber tracts, but once the fiber tracts have been laid down, they are insulated with myelin, as all of you know. And it turns out that myelin and the thickness of myelin depends upon how much we use a fiber tract. So the more you use a fiber tract, the thicker the myelin gets. And the thicker the myelin gets, the more efficient that fiber tract becomes. Teachers build myelin by teaching children new things, but then having them practice it over and over and over and over again. So every teacher in this room has had the situation where a student says, why do I have to do this homework? Why do I have to do 10 long division problems? Why do I have to do these square root things at home? I know how to do them. I showed you I know how to do it. Well, you can now tell them, well, you're building myelin. That's why you have to. Okay, and I'm sure they'll be thrilled with that, and that will be all they need to be motivated. All right, but that's what happens. So the brain is a use it or lose it organ. The more we use a fiber tract, the more you're saying to the brain, this is important, make sure it's well insulated, and myelin is produced. Then the other thing teachers do, besides build more myelin, is that the neurons also have, in addition to the long fiber tracts, the axons, as you all know, they have dendrites. Dendrites are little fingers. Each neuron has, in the cerebrum, each neuron has 1,000 or more dendrites. The dendrites are growing and receding your whole life. They're growing and receding right now. Hopefully they're growing more than they're receding, so that you're getting new information. So when you get information that's new, when you learn something new that you never knew before, these dendrites are attracted by the chemical signal that's sent out with an axon sending information that's somewhat novel. And they grab onto that axon or grab onto a neuron they've never touched before, attracted by the chemicals that are being released in the tip of the axon. The tip of every axon has little bubbles called synaptic vesicles, and they're loaded with chemicals. And when there's an electrical impulse in an axon, opens up those bubbles, they dump out their chemicals, and then dendrites are attracted to it and they grow into that axon. Now, teachers then are teaching new content all the day, all the time. So every time you teach new content, you're literally creating new connections. But one of the problems is new connections are fragile. And if you don't use them and repeat using them, they recede. So to get a new connection to make it through the night, night is the dump cycle of your brain. Night is when your brain goes through and consolidates important connections, solidifies them, kind of like Jell-O settling, and gets rid of connections that aren't necessary, all right, or useful to you. And that's so that your brain doesn't become this chaotic mess of information that you can't use very well. So the brain has a priority system. The brain's a very expensive organ, by the way. A new connection uses a lot of calories. You burn more calories when you talk than when you walk. Now, I know you don't believe that for a minute, and I know every woman in this room is thinking, oh, then I'd be really, really thin. But you don't build muscle when you think. But thinking that neurons are extraordinarily expensive cells for the body. They use 3 times the metabolism of any other cells in your body. So the brain doesn't want a bunch of connections that it has to support metabolically. And it gets rid of them. And the way the brain decides, when you're sleeping, which new connections make it, which ones get consolidated, and which ones recede and disappear, is based on the chemicals, how strong the chemicals of neuroplasticity were released when you learned that. And I'll talk about those neurochemicals, but that's the how of teaching. So if, as a teacher, you make the information really exciting and really fun and really new and get the child engaged, and then the child gets engaged and you reinforce them and say, wow, I can't believe that you got that spelling word today. That's fantastic. That's sending chemicals into the brain that are saying, this must be important, save it tonight when you go to sleep. But if it's trivial, if it's incidental, if it's something you tell a student in passing and they don't really grab onto it, that's one of the first ones to go. So how dynamic you are as a teacher, how engaged you get the students to be in your classroom as a teacher, and how well you reinforce them when they get it right determines which make it through the night and which don't. Now, the advantage neuroscientists have is they can take that same information and build it into software, build it into technology, so that you drive the neurochemicals of plasticity to prioritize that information, so when children go to sleep, that information is consolidated, not dropped. Got it? And teachers do the same thing. So teachers build brains in 3 ways. They add myelin by getting children to practice things that they've learned. They create new connections. And then they increase this chemical cocktail in the brain that drives neuroplasticity, that drives these changes to make it through the night. Now, the specific neurochemicals, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you how, as teachers, you augment these, okay? By the how of teaching. So I'm going to start with the one at the top you can barely see because it's written in white, which on a white background isn't a very smart way to do this, but is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, you all know well, because it's an arousal neuromodulator. It's what wakes you up in the morning. Acetylcholine is upregulated, that's a term we use in neuroscience. From the time you get up in the morning, it's what wakes you up, and it upregulates. You get more and more acetylcholine for about 4 hours in the morning. So if you're up at 6 in the morning, if that's when you wake up, by 10 in the morning, your acetylcholine is going to be at its peak. Okay? You will be as alert as you can be at about 10 in the morning. And then you stay alert until about 6 o'clock at night. 4 hours before you go to bed, it starts down-regulating, so that by 10 o'clock at night, you're sleepy and you're ready to go to sleep. Got it? Now, you can mess that up. You can fool with Mother Nature. So one way you can fool with Mother Nature is with caffeine. Notice my Starbucks? Yes. Okay. And what caffeine does is it changes this clock. So instead of you upregulating slowly from 6 to 10, caffeine upregulates acetylcholine faster. And it's called a cholinergic drug. Any drug that increases acetylcholine levels is cholinergic. All right, caffeine is cholinergic. So I'm more awake sooner. I get up at 6, I have my cup of coffee at 6:15. I'm at my peak acetylcholine level at 7. But guess what? I can't fool Mother Nature. So instead of downregulating acetylcholine at 6 p.m., what time do you think it starts downregulating if I drink caffeine? My triple shot espresso macchiato, I'm going to be like this at about 2:30 in the afternoon. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Yes. So if you change the clock, the brain just readjusts because it's plastic, and then you get really sleepy in the afternoon. So what do to keep that from happening? You take another cholinergic shot of your triple espresso shot macchiato, and you're wide awake then. Except the problem is you're wide awake for another 5 hours. So at 9 o'clock, your acetylcholine levels have not started to downregulate yet, and you're wide awake. And you're wide awake at 11. And you're wide awake at 12. And then if you do something like take an anticholinergic drug, like Benadryl or something stronger, then yes, you'll go to sleep. But what happens at 2 in the morning, friends? You're wide awake. Because the brain says, oh, I don't know what's going on here. Okay, now, how do teachers change acetylcholine? Sorry, you can't see it at all up here, but it says acetylcholine. How does a teacher upregulate acetylcholine? Because activities in the environment can upregulate acetylcholine. I'll give you some examples of cholinergic activities. Television can be cholinergic. It can get kids jacked up. Video games can really get kids jacked up. If you have a child who's having trouble going to bed on time at night, one thing you don't want to do is let them play video games after dinner. Because video games increase acetylcholine. Okay? Increase acetylcholine levels. There's something about the screen and the digitized aspect of a screen and animation that increases acetylcholine. Okay, but as a teacher, you can increase it. You can increase it by doing this. Just by moving around and establishing eye contact. And when you do, doesn't that put you a little on edge when I come over here? Yes. And so when a teacher moves around and kind of keeps an eye on the students and establishes eye contact, that increases this arousal of the students, and that actually accelerates learning. You can't learn anything new if you don't have acetylcholine upregulated. So if you're asleep, when your acetylcholine is at its very lowest level, if you're in a deep sleep, even if you're dreaming, even if it's a deep REM sleep, your acetylcholine levels are too low for you to remember, and that's why you don't ever remember your dreams. Did you know that? It's all based on acetylcholine. Isn't that something? But what wakes you up from a dream is when your acetylcholine is boosted a little bit, and so then you remember the dream. So remember dreams if you wake up during them, because it's acetylcholine that wakes you up. So when you wake your students up by walking around, by establishing eye contact, you're upregulating acetylcholine. You're going to increase learning. Isn't that something? Okay, now, another neuromodulator that teachers can control to some extent in their students is norepinephrine. Video games also increase norepinephrine levels, but so does anything that's novel. So I want you to think of norepinephrine as the, wow, that's interesting neuromodulator, okay? So norepinephrine makes the most boring subject in the world fascinating. And if you take a norepinephrine enhancer, and you probably know some norepinephrine enhancer drugs like Ritalin, Concerta, Strattera, those are all norepinephrine enhancers. And what they do is this. I didn't know that. Quadratic equations are fascinating. I had no idea that you could do that. So of course the students pay better attention, right? Now, how does a teacher do that? By doing things like this. Wait till you see what we're going to do today, kids. It's so cool. It is so much fun. You're going to love it. We're going to learn the letters that go with the sounds. All right? It is such a neat thing. You're not going to believe how neat this is. Did you know that all those letters you see around you have a sound that goes with them? Billy, stand up. I want you to be a P. Make a letter P. Show us all, what does a capital P look like? That's right. Now, did you know that if I do this, I could blow on my arm, and that's a P sound. How do you like that? So I've made a balloon out of my body here and made a capital P, and I'm going to make a sound to keep that balloon open. That's a P. And if kids go, wow, you've upregulated norepinephrine. Okay. Okay. Now, we can do that. You know, neuroscientists can do that. They can increase norepinephrine levels by making the exercises that they're having a student do for any boring subject, like perceiving the difference between a pa and a ba. They can just turn it into a game. And if you turn something into a game, and it's novel and it's fun, that increases norepinephrine. Teachers can do it too, and you do it all the time. That's what a science lab is for. It's to make it come real. It's to make it be novel, to be fun. Okay. Now, the next neuromodulator chemical that teachers can control is dopamine. Dopamine acts on the reward center of our brain, which is deep in our brain, in the limbic system, in the emotional part of the brain. And when you get a reward, that your limbic system say, remember this, remember this, remember this. This is really, really, really important. So dopamine is the save button of your brain's computer. If there's a new connection that's been made, it's dopamine that's going to make sure that it makes it through the night. And it's probably, that has been built into us through evolution, so that when the guy finds the cute girl, he remembers where she lives. And when the hunter finds a great source of some kind of food they like, fish or something, that he remembers where he found them. But the problem with dopamine is that you get dopamine upregulated when you're rewarded by food or by anything pleasurable, but you also get it when you're punished. So it was probably, again, evolution that enabled us to have this dopaminergic system that if we were hunting and there was a lion there and he bit off our toe, we'd remember to avoid that place. So dopamine is the save button, both activated by reward and activated by punishment. But every time you reward a student, every time you go, oh my gosh, look at these notes. Have you ever seen such clear, would you stand up? No, I'm kidding. When you do that to a student, they go, wow. And she may not remember anything today, but I promise you tonight, her little brain will reconsolidate what dopamine does. Because she was reinforced or punished, depending on her attitude toward that being singled out, but when that term dopamine was being discussed. And she will remember dopamine till the day she dies, and she may kill me for that. All right. But that's how teachers are just the how of teaching, the methods that they use, create this brain that's changing all the time. And this is where the power of teaching comes in. Power of teaching isn't so much the content, it's the way a teacher makes all the information seem interesting and new and fun. And each of you is here today because these are addictive neuromodulators. We like them. They're excitatory. You're all here today because you're addicted to learning. You gave up a day, didn't you? And you paid to come here, and you went to the trouble to come here, and it's because you love to learn new things. And that's a good addiction. And it's addiction that served you well, because it's made you professionally very competent and very curious and always growing. So that's kind of what we want to do with our kids, isn't it? We want them to be addicted to learning and not addicted to video games and not addicted to other kinds of things that aren't as constructive to the human brain. So that's what teachers do. That's how they change brains. And the brains, the major parts of the brain that they're changing is this huge fiber tract here, this big blue one, and this yellow one, largely. The big blue one, I'll show you this slide. No, I don't have it there. This big blue fiber tract, the superior longitudinal fasciculus, and that just means the top long fiber tract, right, in Latin. But this big blue fiber tract links, look at what it links, and I'll go over there to show them next, the reward center of the limbic system, the brain's in the middle of the brain, with the word form area in the occipital lobe, bottom of the occipital lobes right here, with the superior temporal gyrus that perceives sounds, with the parietal lobe, number and body sense, with the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus that handle symbol systems, and carries it all forward to the inferior frontal lobe. That's what that fiber tract does. So down here, if you couldn't see where I was before, this is your reward center. This is where the bottom of the occipital lobe is, the visual word form area. This is the top of the temporal lobe, the superior temporal gyrus. This is the angular gyrus. This is the supramarginal gyrus. And this is the parietal lobe body sense carrying it all forward to the frontal lobe. This is a fiber tract teachers build. And guess when it starts building and myelinating? Does anyone know? What age? You probably don't, because no one knew until 2008 when the first DTIs of this were done. It starts building at 5. And guess when it finishes building? You want to take a gander when it's finished being myelinated for the most part? Although we can continue to myelinate fiber tracts our whole lives. But when its major calendar of maturation is coming to it, is kind of leveling off, 20. So it coincides almost perfectly with school years in every major industrialized country. Okay? Now the other fiber tract teachers build, the other one that's forming later on in life during school years, and actually it starts forming even later than 5, it starts at around 11, is this yellow one. It's called the uncinate fasciculus, and it's very important for executive functions. Executive functions are things like being organized, planning ahead, being goal-oriented, being able to monitor outcomes of your actions, being able to edit. And who really works on things like organization and planning ahead and checking your work and monitoring outcomes? Teachers. So those are the 2 major fiber tracts that we teach to. And then there are other fiber tracts. If you were an athlete, you would have this big red one, the corpus callosum, and this green one here that regulates just basic movement. That's what you would be helping to mature. So depending on where we go and who we see and what kind of interventions and training and experiences we have when we're young, these fiber tracts build at different rates. But what's important for all of us here today is that everything that we do in school is dependent largely on this left hemisphere fiber tract that supports language. So language, we say, is superimposed, or reading is superimposed on the language networks. And what that means for all of you is if a child comes to school and language skills are weak for any reason, learning becomes difficult for that student. Okay? So this is reading itself then. This is Stanislas Dehaene's book. And tell me when we're ready for our break. Is it now? All right. So why don't we stop here, and then we'll get specifically into reading and look at the reading brain and look at the fMRIs for reading brain, and we'll take just a quick bio food break, right? Do you want to say something? Just
break for about 10 minutes. Please help yourself to coffee and tea and sandwiches outside on the right side. But I think to save time, maybe we can just bring the food in so that we can get started again fairly soon. Thank you.
Parietal lobe and how number sense is body sense, and talks about the neuroscience of that too. But I just want to show you a few slides on reading. And now that you've seen the language network, you can see how reading is superimposed on the language network in the brain. So here you have a young reader just learning how to decode. And so this is the part of the brain that's linking their ability to perceive the sounds in words with this, at the bottom of the occipital lobe, this ability to recognize letters. So this is a child who's decoding, but not very fluent. I can tell you whether a child's fluent or not by how much frontal lobe activity I see. So this is an adult reader, and here you see the adult reader is quite fluent and is not decoding much at all. And you can also see when you see more of the side of the temporal lobe, like there, involved on an fMRI scan, that's meaning. So that's the person really getting a lot of comprehension out of what they're reading. And the frontal lobe activity means that they're reading easily and effortlessly. So those fiber tracts are carrying the information forward to the frontal lobe. So this is the child learning a math problem. It's actually a child doing 8 repetitions of a quadratic equation. And you can see kind of the same organization where the brain starts out most active in the back of the brain. And in this case, again, that's the angular gyrus, which is going to be linking the ability, the body sense, with the numerals. And the child is working with that, the numerals and the organization of them in the quadratic equation. They're not really numerals, they're just symbols that represent x's and y's, etc. And then as the child is mastering the task, you see the frontal lobe become more active. This inferior radio frontal region. God didn't like that, did he? Okay. But that, so what we have then is this inferior frontal lobe becoming active, and that tells us the student's gotten good at the problems and can do them quickly and easily. So that's how fMRIs can help us to kind of figure out how the brain is operating. And as I said, the brain is plastic. So the old paradigm was a child was born with kind of the whatever cognitive skills they have of their parents, and you just dealt with it as a teacher. If they were smart, they were smart, and they learned easily. If they weren't smart, they weren't smart. But we now know the brain can change. And so neuroscience-based interventions then are designed to get in and build those left hemisphere symbolic processing networks for language and math. That's really what they're all about in fluency. And in this case, the company that is supporting bringing me here to Singapore Scientific Learning has a series of brain fit programs that are working on memory and attention, and I'll show you that in a minute. Some reading series that actually work on reading, decoding, and spelling rules and comprehension. And then something called Reading Assistant, and I think Cheryl may talk about it a little bit. But Reading Assistant, which is an oral reading, an assisted reading program on a computer, where the student hears any grade level material you want read to them, grade level of kindergarten through 3rd or all the way up to 12th grade. And they hear it read, then they read it. The computer helps them if they struggle with words, and then it records their reading so that as they read faster and better and more accurately, they can hear and be reinforced by their own reading, and then that's saved in the program. So those are some neuroscience interventions. Now that you know the brain so well, you can start to see how neuroscience helps us to test the efficacy of a program for training reading. So on the left you see, again, 35, that's kind of a magic number for doing statistical studies, 35 typical 7-year-olds who are reading normally. And the task that they're doing in the fMRI scanner is a rhyming task. So if those of you who teach reading know it's called a phonological awareness task. And when you have typical readers do rhyming, the areas that light up are the angular gyrus that links the symbols, sounds, and letters together, and the inferior frontal region. And that's what you see. And those are the two areas that are the strongest. Now, this is 35 children diagnosed with dyslexia. They're also 7 years of age. They can rhyme, so they're doing the same rhyming task in the fMRI scanner. But when they do it, you don't see any activation of the angular gyrus at all, and no activation of the part of the inferior frontal cortex that is important for sequencing, grammar, and fluency. After they went through 6 weeks of training on the Fast Forward Language program, and this is in Stanislas Dehaene's book, what you see is their brain is now normalized. We see activation of the visual word form area down at the bottom here. We see activation of the angular gyrus, and we see activation of the inferior frontal lobe. Now, it doesn't mean that those programs built neurons. The neurons were already there. What it's done is it's exercised the brain so those neurons are communicating with each other. And that fiber tract, that major fiber tract, the superior longitudinal vesiculus, is now being exercised enough that the students have the capacity to learn to read. Okay? And we know that when we see students in gifted and talented programs, that we or accepted children, excluding gifted and talented programs, but children with special needs, that when we use these kinds of interventions, that this is from the United States, the number of children classified with learning disabilities goes way down, because what you've done is you've driven the brain to learn much more easily and efficiently. And there's a 13% decrease in the number of children identified with learning disabilities. And one of the states in the United States, Nevada, ranked all of the reading interventions in the state for their efficacy, for their achievement gains. And the one they found gave the greatest gains in the state was the Fast Forward program. So what neuroscience-based programs like Fast Forward do is they don't teach skills. They don't teach mathematics. They don't teach reading per se. They just build up the underlying networks that support memory, attention, processing, and sequencing. What we consider the cognitive skills that support learning. And just to show you, I'm going to skip this. It's a working memory task I was going to do with you, but I'd rather spend time on things you can do in the classroom yourself. But this is just a working memory task where you see 15 words and then you write them down. But what I want to show you is when you do work on working memory as a teacher, and a lot of education involves memory, working memory, but when you do it as a teacher, we now know that it improves something called fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the ability to solve novel problems you've never seen before. So it's a measure of intelligence, but it's not IQ per se. It's a measure of intelligence in problem-solving tasks. And what the test that these researchers used, Suzanne Jaggi was the primary researcher in the Netherlands. But she had adults come in, you can see 35 again, that magical number, but she had 35 in the training group that did working memory activities every day in her computer lab, and then 35 controls that just did video games. And she tested them on the Raven's Progressive Matrices, which is a test where you see, if you don't know what it is, it's just puzzles that you have to solve, visual puzzles. And you have pieces of the puzzle that have been removed, and you have to figure out which piece fits in that puzzle by looking at it. And it's considered a test of fluid intelligence, of this kind of capacity to solve problems you've never seen before. And what you can see is before the experiment, or before the working memory training, both groups were equivalent in their scores on the Ravens. After they went through the training, the group that did video games showed a slight improvement. They went from a standard score of 98 to a standard score of 101. So they went up by 3 standard score points, but that's not significant. But the group that received working memory training went from a standard score of 98 to a standard score of 100 and about 115 to 116. And that is a significant improvement in the ability in fluid intelligence. So working on working memory supports the cognitive skills for reasoning, it looks like. And then this was another study done, published in the journal Child Neuropsychology in 2012, just last year. And you can see that what they did is they did working memory with students in classrooms. And what they found is that the children who did working memory activities every day in the classroom had significant improvement in reading comprehension compared to students who just went through regular classroom activities but didn't do working memory tests. So I'm going to give you some ideas for how to put working memory tasks into your classroom in just a minute. The way working memory presents in your classroom, if you have a child who has working memory problems, just so you know, they're often slow on multiple choice tests, even though they know the answer. So a child who has a working memory problem will do this on a multiple choice test. They'll read the question, they'll read A, the first answer, possible, they'll read B, then they have trouble remembering the question, so they go back and reread the question. Then they read A and B again, and C. Then they go back and double check the question again. They think it's C, but they're not sure, so they read D. They double check and read A again, and then B again, read the question again, and then decide it is C, and they answer it. Now, how far along is the kid sitting next to them without a working memory problem? They're on 4 or 5 questions later. So when children have working memory problems, what you see is they're very slow on multiple choice tests because they reread it all the time. And if you can speed up their working memory, you actually get higher scores on their multiple choice tests because they get through them faster. The next thing you'll see, if a child has trouble with working memory, you'll see that they're the kids that are rereading paragraphs all the time in textbooks and in books. So they'll read a paragraph and then they reread it again. And by the way, when you're distracted, or if you're reading something that's really hard to comprehend, you'll find yourself doing the same thing, rereading it over and over again. You'll do it when you're tired. So that's a sign that a child has working memory problems. Or kids who have trouble with memorization. Children who have trouble, young children who have trouble memorizing the alphabet, young children who have trouble memorizing math facts, or older children that have trouble, older students that have trouble memorizing history dates. And just those memory aspects of school, especially elementary school, children with working memory problems will show problems with memorization. They take longer to complete homework because they keep rereading everything all the time. And you'll see that they have a lot of trouble, oftentimes, on word problems in math. Because all of the tasks that go into comprehending the word problem in math and then solving it and thinking it out, they forget where they were. I'll tell you something else I'll show you trouble with. Kids with working memory problems have a terrible time with written narratives, sentences. They have trouble with book reports. They have trouble with essay tests because they think of what they're going to say, but by the time they go to write it down, they forget what they were going to write down. So working memory can really affect school. So what are the things you can work on to improve working memory in your students? Practice with them reading it once and not going back. So that they're learning how to read something and not have the luxury of going back to read it again, so that they concentrate more and try to hold on to the information the first time. So I'm going to show you an example of that right now. So I'm going to have you all read this, and you won't be able to go back. And keep in mind, if you write things down, you're not memorizing it, right? It's not memory. So Jane is older than Susie. Susie's older than William. Lily is older than William, but younger than Jane. Betsy is older than Susie, but younger than Lily. Are you ready? Okay. Who is the youngest? Okay, who is the oldest? I know, you gave up. It's too late in the afternoon. Okay, which is the correct family order? Now, if I were to do this in a classroom, I'd put the little thing on, let everybody have a chance to read it a little longer than you did, and then they can't go back and look again. So you want them to get used to having to answer questions about information just by looking once, not being able to go back and review. That forces them to exercise working memory. A few things to notice from this activity: that allowing plenty of time on the first item, make sure you have all the information, is helpful. I went too fast deliberately. But if I'd given you lots of time, you could have really sat there and done the relationships in your head, and you would have held on to it faster. And you might even give the students a strategy for holding on to the information. So you might say, well, you know, make a picture in your head of Lily, and that Lily is bigger than, in size, than somebody else. Some other activities just for different disciplines in teaching that actually build working memory. In language arts, reading comprehension is always a working memory task, as long as the student can't go back and check the paragraph. So whenever you're doing reading comprehension and you're saying, okay, read it, and then once you finish reading it, turn the page over and answer the questions, then that becomes a working memory task. In the language, fast forward language, reading tasks, they have something called Book Monkeys, which is a reading comprehension task where the students read a passage and then it's gone. And then they have to ask the questions about it. And if they get the questions wrong, then it will show them the passage again. And the reason they do that is they want the students to start really trying to concentrate the first time, because that speeds up reading skills and working memory. Math teachers, it's quite boring. This probably happens a lot, does it? Oh, okay. You see, in Chicago this doesn't happen. Certainly not in March. Okay. Math teachers, did you know Sudoku works on working memory? So does Ken-Ken, if you've ever seen Ken-Ken. And word problems, as I said earlier, really stretch working memory skills. For history teachers, timelines. For discussions and solving what-if questions are a way you can do working memory. And science teachers, all lab experiments. If you have a set of instructions a student has to go through and can't refer back to the instructions, that's working memory. One thing those of you who are teachers can think of doing is starting the day with a little memory game, a little working memory game. So maybe at the beginning of the day, if you're whatever kind of teacher you are, you might bring in 4 interesting facts that will be new to the students. So let's say you're a history teacher and you're covering the history of Malaysia and the history of Singapore and its independence. So you might on Friday come in with 4 little facts of maybe who the first elected prime minister, do you have prime ministers in Singapore? Of Singapore would have been, maybe who the last king would have been, monarch, something like that. You put the 4 facts on the board, let the students kind of live with it a minute, and then later in the day, test the students and say, who remembers who was the first prime minister? And any student that gets all 4 right, maybe they get their name on the board that day as the memory king or something. So you can do that in any class. Just bring in fun facts and start the day with them, and you're actually exercising working memory and turning it into a game, which increases norepinephrine. All right. The key to building working memory skills is not to emphasize the outcome. So unlike most things in school, when what we're trying to do is say, okay, if you get it all right, you get an A or a really good grade, and if you don't get it all right, then you don't get a good grade. When you're exercising something like working memory, the goal isn't that they got it right, the goal is that they're trying. So in Susan Jagge's tasks, both with reading comprehension and then with the adults, it didn't matter whether they got the working memory test right or not to boost their intelligence, or fluid intelligence. What mattered is that they did it 20 minutes a day. So it is the actual process of working on working memory that improves the capacity. So don't penalize students who struggle. Rather, try to give them opportunities to succeed and be successful. Okay, we talked about the neuromodulators. All right, now let's talk about processing, auditory processing. You can also work on visual processing and speed of processing. One of the things that the neuroscience-based programs work on is processing speed. And by the way, other neuroscience programs out there also work on working memory. Besides Fast for Word, some of you have talked to me about CogMed. CogMed is a working memory program. It's just a little different. It's visual. But when we get to processing, there aren't very many neuroscience programs yet that emphasize processing. But I'm going to show you why some of them do. In 1973, Paula Tallal, who was at Rutgers University in New York in the U.S., was looking at, I don't know how many of you remember Osgood's model of intelligence, but it was a model that was very popular in the 50s and 60s. And it was kind of a cube, and he said intelligence is made up of all these different pillars. And one of the pillars that he had in his model of intelligence was sequencing skills. And Paula Tallal was a cognitive psychologist, she still is, but she was interested in whether sequencing problems, children who have problems sequencing, if sequencing problems could underlie reading and language problems. And so she devised an experiment where students had to sequence 2 tones. That's all they had to do. So it wasn't a language task. All they had to do was they heard a high note and a low note, or a low note and a high note, and they just had to say high, low, or low, high. So the task would be like this. You can do it with me. Beep, beep, low, high, beep, beep, high, low. Okay, that's all they had to do, and sometimes the tones were the same. And what she discovered, much to her disappointment, because she wanted a grant in this, where she was going to get lots of money, is that the language and reading impaired students, the blue dots, were just as good at sequencing as typical learners. And these were kids who were 7 and 8 years of age. But she all of a sudden discovered, after doing this in a few trials, that it depended on how fast the sounds came together. And what you see down here, ISI, is interstimulus interval. If the space in time between the 2 tones was, say, 3 seconds, 3,000 milliseconds, so it would sound like this, beep, beep, the children who had the language and reading problems did just fine. And they did just fine even when it was a second apart, 940 milliseconds. They were still doing fine with the sequencing task. But when all of a sudden she dropped to 1/3 of a second long, beep, beep, suddenly the kids who had the language and reading problems could no longer sequence. They were barely above chance. They were just getting just barely, 65% of them right. And when you went down to 150 milliseconds, they went just to chance level. They were just guessing. And she realized that it wasn't sequencing that was the problem, that it seemed to be the speed with which these sounds were being presented to the kids. And it turns out in neuroscience, and it's no accident probably, that for years in education, what was our euphemism for students who struggled? They were slow. And what is our euphemism for students who do well in school? Fast, quick. Oh, he's quick. He picks things up quickly. Oh, he's quick. He's quick-minded, right? Or if somebody's funny, they're quick-witted. Well, that's processing speed. And processing speed, or processing, you might say, has to do with how myelinated the fiber tracts are and how well practiced they are. So, but certainly Paula Tallal didn't know that at all in 1973. But she discovered that speed of processing was an issue. And coincidentally, when the students really started to struggle, it was when the sounds were about as far apart as phonemes in words. So, just as an example, how many of you know how long the average syllable is? You do know this, but you may not know that you know it. Does anyone? No. No, not me. I was just scratching my head. Okay. So, you know how long the average syllable is because when you count seconds, how many syllables do you use to count seconds? 1 chimpanzee, 2 chimpanzee, or do you go 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000? How many syllables in a second? 4. So the average syllable is 250 milliseconds long. Now if the average syllable is 250 milliseconds long, and I'm going to cheat a little and tell you the average vowel is 150 milliseconds, then how long is the average consonant? About 50 milliseconds. Yeah. So if you have a word like splashed, where you have ash is the vowel, so ash. You have 5 consonants squeezed into a syllable and 150 millisecond vowel. That means a lot of those consonants are less than 40 milliseconds long. So then people started thinking, oh, I get it. That's why children with auditory processing problems do things like omit sounds in words. So they'll hear the word star and say tar. Or they'll hear the word step and say tap. But they can make a sound when it's by itself. They'll say soup. And they might also sequence sounds incorrectly. They might say aminal for animal, because they're having trouble handling the rapidly changing sounds and getting them in the right order. And we did discover that. So if you actually look at processing speed here, I'll just show you how important it is, both for speech perception and then for reading. You'll identify this word quickly.
Say.
Okay? So this is just the acoustic envelope of the word say. This is time here, and this is loudness. The vowel is louder. And you can see this is the S, and then the back part is the A. Now what would happen if I put 100 milliseconds of silence in between the S and the A? I'll give you a shortcut. What you think would happen is that you would hear S-A, right? That this is what you hear.
Stay.
How many of you hear spay? How many of you hear stay? What you've all done is you've all dropped a consonant in there. And the consonant you've dropped in is a stop consonant, a P or a T. A stop consonant is a consonant where you stop the flow of air, that's why it's called a stop consonant, before you make the consonant sound. So, a T, before I release the T to make the T, before I release the T is this. Nothing. Silence. Before I release the P, it's that. And that lasts about 40 milliseconds long. So if you hear a word and there's silence in there, your brain thinks it's a stop consonant, and it just drops it in, and you perceive it. So it's just an auditory illusion, kind of like a visual illusion. But imagine what happens to children who have processing problems. You can imagine that sometimes they're putting sounds in that don't belong in the word, and sometimes they're not hearing sounds that do belong in the word. So auditory processing is a disorder where children can't perceive rapidly changing sounds. And because of that, they have a lot of trouble perceiving speech sounds because they move so quickly. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about is attention, and I should say that it's easy to train that skill of auditory processing. You just give students what we call listening tasks, auditory training, where they listen to pa, 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 da, and the second it changes, they have to press a button, and you just train the brain to wire itself for those sounds. You can do it very quickly and very efficiently as long as they wear headphones and the sounds are very clear for the child. Now the last thing that neuroscience can work on, or the major last thing I want to talk about today, and then we'll take questions, is attention. Like a lot of other things, we thought you were either born a good attender or you were not. But it turns out attention is learned. And you acquire the ability, and children acquire the ability to pay attention and focus their attention and sustain it. And that's called selective attention. And that matures over time. Now, the opposite of selective attention is open attention, where you can't just tune in on one stimulus, but rather you are open to the world. So I'm going to be a child with open attention. I think you'll recognize them. And I'm going to walk in the room, in your classroom. Here I come. Hi, ooh, lots of people. Ooh, what's that? That's cool. That looks like a TV set or something. Where does that go? Oh, look at these. Wow. What's this? Can you blow it? Oh, I wonder if it's oh, look. Oh, I love these Oh, what are those? Oh, you know what? I think you can bounce those. Do you want to play ball? Okay. Do you know any children like this? Okay, that's open attention. Now, you might think open attention's a bad thing, but it really isn't. To play soccer, you have to have open attention. You have to be aware of all the guys around you and who might be coming up on the side and who might be blocking what you're trying to do. To play any team sports, you need open attention. You need open attention to be an artist. You need open attention to be an actor. You have to watch for details. Writers have very open attention. They're very aware of the world around them and all the details. Okay? But there's one place where open attention really hurts you. Can you guess where it is? A classroom. Where there's one person talking, and that one person wants you to pay undivided attention to them all the time. So when children have problems with attention, when they're easily distractible, and they have this open attention, it's devastating for school achievement. Well, it turns out you can train selective attention. So Courtney Stevens, who's an expert on attention, and she's a neuroscientist whose whole area is attention, actually did a study at the University of Oregon. And what she did was, can I use this? She had children listen to, did I skip? Okay. She just had children listen to stories, and she was taking EEGs while they were listening to stories. And she would introduce distracting stimuli, either words or sounds, while they're listening to the story to see how easily they were distracted. And she used language and reading impaired children, typically developing children, and then had a control group, which you all know is the best way to study something, because then you can tell if in fact it's the intervention that you used. And the intervention they used was fast forward language, and that's what the FFW is. And after they went through that for 6 weeks, the children with language and reading impairment showed a significant ability to focus and sustain their attention and ignore distractions. The typically developing children showed big improvements too. The only group that didn't were children sitting in a classroom getting just normal instruction without any attentional training. So it turns out you can train attention. The consequences in the classroom for children who have attentional problems is very similar to children who have working memory problems, and they often go together, is they have a devil of a time following directions. And I say to parents, and that's also true of children with auditory processing problems, so when a parent is bringing a child to me and they say to evaluate them, one of the first questions I ask them is, how good is your child at following directions? And if they say, he's horrible, you know, or if the parent says, he's always saying what? So I say, Billy, go up and get your coat. I think it's going to rain, so close your window. Don't forget your spelling homework, because we really worked a long time on that. And the kid says, what? Huh? That's often a sign that the child has attention or processing problems. And that's harder for you to work on in the classroom, but you can work on it in the classroom by having games that you play where you might say, I'm going to say the word house 4 times today. And I want you, if you hear the word house, to raise your hand. And so the kids will listen very intently for whenever you play the word house. What you want What you want to make sure of, though, is that they don't just listen for house and don't listen to anything else. Okay. And then lastly, fluency, we know, is an issue for a lot of students. It's the cause of math slowness at reading, but then also slowness in doing lots of things, like math problems. And we can exercise fluency with activities where children just read and are able to hear themselves read, as I said, and they're corrected. And you can build fluency 20-30% in a very short period of time. Now, this is just a chart of a school district in the United States where they plotted the school district against the state average. So the state average is in blue, and the red line is the school district, St. Mary's Parish. And in 2007, they introduced the Brain Fit programs of Fast Forward. And that year, the students caught up with the state average. And then in 2008, they introduced Reading Assistant, and the students actually surpassed the state average the next year and continued to climb beyond that. So we know that the brain is plastic, we know it can change, and we know that building underlying cognitive skills actually causes the brain to mature in key areas that support learning. And I will stop there. We have time for about 10 minutes for questions. And then did you want to show the video? Just a short one? Okay. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. You don't want to go out and get wet. Anything? Okay, good. I'm going to use this so they can hear.
Hi, Dr. Martha. I'm from the Dyslexia Association of Singapore.
Oh.
Yeah. And of course, I've seen quite a number of fMRI images in my line of work. And typically for dyslexic students, what we normally observe is an activation of the right hemisphere as compared to the left hemisphere. Can you explain why this is so, and how does this translate to them reading the way that they are reading?
Gosh, that's a fantastic question. And I'm actually going to show you what he's talking about. I'm going to go back to a slide we had earlier. This way so I can get to it fairly quickly. So if we go back up to this reading slide from Stanislas Dehaene, it actually was research that Stanislas Dehaene covers it in his book, but it actually was research done and published in the journal Nature Reviews Neuroscience by Turkeltaub, and it was fMRI scans of reading of young children and adults in 2003. The young child, I emphasized this, didn't I? I emphasized that the young child is decoding, and then the more mature adult is using their frontal lobe, and that makes them fluent, and they're getting much better access to meaning, and we can tell that because of the activation of the temporal lobe. What I didn't emphasize, which is your very astute question, is that the young reader is using their right hemisphere. And the reason the young reader or the decoder, the child who's actively decoding and or guessing at what a word is, relies heavily on the first letter and last letter of the word. They don't break the word into pieces, into the phonemes. So I'll give you an example of this. I have a child who's dyslexic, my own daughter, and she's now fine. She's in her 30s, and she's vice president of a corporation in New York. But we had a long, hard stretch getting there. But we used to go to a restaurant every Friday night called Yesterday's. And it was just the name of it. And it was their favorite restaurant, and they got cheeseburgers, and I got salads. And her second grade teacher, Camille's second grade teacher, was Mrs. Yasutake. Started with a Y and ended, had a lot of syllables and some of the same letters in it. And so she called Yesterday's Yasutake's. And I know you see children who are dyslexic do that all the time. So she knew it was a long letter. She knew it started with a Y, and she wasn't parsing the word into letters. She was just seeing it as a whole. Well, it turns out that's what your right hemisphere does very well. Your right hemisphere is a Gestalt processor. So it gets things as a whole. Your right hemisphere recognizes melodies, for example. Because to recognize a melody, you have to think of the whole melody in your head. So for example, there used to be a TV show called Name That Tune. And if you play part of a tune, you'd see if people could name it. And so if I do that with you, da 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 da, you know what the next sound is. That's your right hemisphere. Your right hemisphere, if I cover my face like this, fills in the rest of the face. So that you don't think I've all of a sudden lost half my face. It's called perceptual fill-in. Because the right hemisphere looks for the unification and whole. Well, so for when children are dyslexic, because they're not parsing words into letters, they tend to rely on their right hemisphere to memorize the whole word at a time. And that's what a child who is dyslexic often does. And if they can't recognize a word, let's say they have the word house, and they can't recognize the word house, they might read it as hose or horse. Now, a lot of young children do that. They try to get words all at once. And that's one of the early stages of reading. So they rely on their right hemisphere for that. And then they also use pictures to help them guess what the word is. And that's why we have picture books for young children. But as you get older, you don't need picture books anymore. And you've shifted to your left hemisphere. So really what you're looking at is the child trying to compensate by trying to memorize whole words at a time. So excellent, excellent question. Thank you. Do you have any other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Safia, and you were talking about dyslexia and all that. So one of my students is dyslexic, so I'm just wondering as a teacher, how then can I help her? She's now 16 years old. I'm not sure whether she's having some intervention outside of school, but I know that she is struggling in all her subjects. So I'm not really sure how I can help her then as a classroom teacher.
Okay, well, so as a classroom teacher, one thing we know is phonics-based approaches are excellent, and I'm sure the gentleman over here could give you some teaching strategies. She may still not be able to decode very well, so you can help her with that. Another thing you can do as a classroom teacher is give her more opportunities to sit and read with you. The problem is once children get to be that old, they're embarrassed reading out loud when they're dyslexic. But if she has time that she can just sit down and read with you, that's important. But the first thing I would recommend for any child with dyslexia is one of these neuroscience-based interventions. That she can do it on a computer at home, or do maybe if there's a break in the day, so that she can get the brain, the fiber tracts to be working better. Because otherwise she's just every year going to feel like she's a failure. And what happens with children who are dyslexic, and I'm sure the gentleman here could say this too, is they're smart enough to know. They have normal IQs. That's how they have the diagnosis of dyslexia. So they have normal intelligence. And they figure out, when you're in school, people are kind of thinking of you as either smart or not smart, smart or dumb, and they start feeling dumb. And my own daughter came home, I'll never forget, as long as I live, 2nd grade, and she came home, tears welled up in her eyes, and she said, "Mom, they put me in the dumb reading group today." And you could have knocked me over with a feather, because this is my profession. And I said, "Well, you read beautifully. You and I read at night." What I didn't know is she was memorizing all the words. And when she got to the end of 2nd grade, they were introducing words that she had to decode, and she couldn't decode them. But children start to know, hey, everybody thinks I'm dumb and I look stupid, and they get real demoralized. So if we can give them things they can do on their own at home, computer-based neuroscience activities and reading assistant and things like that to practice, then they can boost their reading skills really effectively. I mean, you saw that dyslexia on here and how the brain just normalizes after 6 weeks. That's all it takes. So I would invest or look into that, or see if the parents could look into that. Because the problem you're going to have as a classroom teacher is you got a whole classroom of students you got to worry about. You can't spend an hour a day every day with her. It would be nice if you could. And if you do, it will be helpful for her if you can find that time. But that's rough for a classroom teacher. Do you have anything else you'd want to add? Okay. All right. And certainly you could refer her to BrainFit. Yeah, because that's what they do, too. Okay, any other questions?
How is it some kids could actually just pick up reading just like that, you know, like at the age of 5, and I have some kids who just read books and they just read so naturally. How? The Marlin?
Yeah, well, it's just so she said, how can some kids do this so easily? If your brain is ready to read, it doesn't really take much instruction for these kids. They just, once you show them the rules, once you say the letters stand for sounds, they go, wow, no kidding. I can read this. Look, feedback. And they love it, and they can't wait to show their parents, and they start trying to write words. But when a child doesn't have the architecture, that's how I describe it. If they don't have the neurological architecture that supports reading, it doesn't make sense to them. What? What do you mean letters make sounds? What do you mean? I mean, what sounds? A, E, D, B, A, K. What's that? That doesn't mean anything to me. E, D, U, K, A, T, O, S. That's not fun. And it's not, they don't get it. It's not registering because the architecture just isn't there to support it yet. And that's why if we can do things with the kids that can drive that architecture to mature, we can just change lives. Just change lives. And that's where neuroscience comes in. That's really the $64,000 question. Yeah.
Yeah, when you talk about exactly these children who pick it up very, very fast, I think what do you think about the importance of motivation? Because children usually who struggle with reading, they don't have any motivations left to do programs like that, especially on a computer.
Okay, that is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful question. Because when I go and talk to teachers all the time and I say, what do you think is the biggest contributing factor to children who do well in school? They almost always say motivation. But now I want to ask you this, and I'll ask you. Are you really good at music? Kind of. Do you play a musical instrument? Yeah, what do you play? Piano. Are you really good at art?
Medium.
Medium, okay. Have you ever taken an art class?
Yes.
Okay. Are you really good at sports?
Yes.
Can you design a computer? No, okay. Usually most of us have things we're really good at and things we're not really good at, right? Now, I don't know about you, and apparently she does play a musical instrument, but my mother had me take piano lessons when I was little. And the biggest contention we had in our family was I never practiced. And I took these piano lessons and I never practiced. Guess why I never practiced? Because I wasn't good at it. I wasn't motivated because it was too hard for me. I have tried to take up sports with my husband. I am a clod. I was born a clod. I come from a family of klutzes. I can't catch balls or throw balls. And Cheryl keeps saying, oh, I can help you, Marty, I can help you. But I have terrible hand-eye coordination. I married a pro athlete. He played basketball professionally. And he wanted me to take up tennis so we could play tennis together. Guess what? I hated tennis. I couldn't stand it. And I couldn't see the ball, and I kept swinging at the air all the time. And finally the tennis instructor said to my husband, let her do something else. Tennis isn't good. Maybe try golf, because the ball just sits there. The reason I give you these examples is when a child is really struggling, they aren't motivated. They just hate it. because it's too hard, it's too frustrating, they feel too dumb. So one of the reasons neuroscientists come up with exercises that aren't reading exercises on a program, but are actually memory exercises and like video games, is to try to get the motivation up and to get the information in a way they feel successful. And so that's what neuroscientists will build these programs, if they do it well, to make them seem game-like, so that you can keep the students' motivation up. Because otherwise, they just get too frustrated and they get too discouraged and they give up. So you're 100% right. It is motivation, but it's motivation because it's so difficult for them. Okay? Now, could you have other motivational things going on? Sure, you could. You could have kids who just really can't sit still, and so they have trouble being motivated. I mean, there are lots of reasons kids could have trouble, but usually when a child is not motivated, it's because it's too hard for them. And that's where motivation comes from. We're motivated to do things we do well, and we're not motivated to do things that we do poorly. When you're young, when you're older, it's a little different. Okay, but excellent question. Anything else? Yeah.
I just wonder, is it ever possible to teach children with ADHD selective attention?
Yes. Yes.
How do you, is there anything that...
Yes, so if you want to look at the research on that, there are a few really good studies. One man who's been looking at, one researcher who's been looking at ADHD and training kids out of ADHD is a man whose name is Klingberg, K-L-I-N-G-B-E-R-G. And you guys know how to do Google Scholar? Okay, so if you go to Google Scholar and you type in Klingberg, and then don't put a comma or anything because it'll search for commas. So just put in Klingberg, then put in ADHD. You'll get all of his work on training kids with ADHD. And the way one of the best ways they found to train ADHD is with working memory exercises. That's one of the most successful ways to improve attention deficit disorder without medication. Any other questions? Okay, Cheryl, you're on.
We thank Dr. Martha Burns for a very informative session. I trust that all of us have benefited. I thought I would just, because over the break as well, we have had some questions on the Fast Forward and Reading Assistant program. Unfortunately, I don't actually have a demo video of the Fast Forward program here, but it is a really, it's an excellent program we've been working with since 2003. So we've got, quite a number of years behind that, and we really see that it is capable of building the cognitive skills like memory, attention, and processing speed. A lot of times, feedback from parents, would be that kids who used to not be able to talk about school, like parents asking kids what happened in school, kids who will not be able to, describe what happened, coming back and after intervention to be able to say, oh, I did this and that. So vocabulary, language, improving, and then of course carrying over into literacy improvements, and even improving in intonation, learning the Chinese language. You know how Chinese has the 4 the 4 intonations. So we've got kids improving in that as well. Even after an intervention like that, because I think what it really does is to drive the brain to be sharper at perception of sound. So unfortunately, I don't have a video of that, but if you can, at the end of the session, fill up the feedback form for us. And if you're interested in seeing, viewing, experiencing any of the programs, we'll be very happy to come to your school to do a demo for you. But I do have a little clip on the Reading Assistant program. So Reading Assistant is really like a personalized coach. And when we talked about motivation, and kids having no motivation to do that, we really see that, and I think this is this is the beauty of neuroscience, where the tools can really match to the student's ability. And when we see that happening, and students know that, yes, I can do that, I can achieve, motivation suddenly is not as big a problem anymore. Yeah, because with the experience of success, then it drives them to say, okay, I'm going to try a little bit harder, and can I do that? And because of the computer technology, it can finally adapt to the individual. So, I think this is something beautiful about neuroscience. So this is just a really short video clip about the Reading Assistant program, which is an online reading coach. So the student does an assessment, all right, and based on the assessment, a library is open to them. that is just at the right level, and the computer actually intervenes, so helping the teacher in the coaching process.
As an educator, you care deeply about the success of your students, and you know that reading is the most important skill they need to succeed in their education and beyond. Take Michael. He's in 2nd grade and working on becoming a fluent reader. But in today's classroom, it's difficult for his teacher to give him all the one-on-one reading help he needs. Imagine if his teacher had a solution that could not only help Michael, but every student, and also save her time during her already full day. Imagine the confidence and success this would bring to Michael and his classmates at every reading level. Thanks to scientific learning, that solution is here. Meet Reading Assistant. Just like a personal interactive tutor, Reading Assistant actually listens to each student read. It's the only reading software with real-time oral reading feedback.
Many people live near Vol.
If a student stumbles or gets stuck, Reading Assistant intervenes by saying the word correctly, volcanoes, providing help at the very moment it's needed most. With on-demand online access, students are able to use the program at school or at home for extra reading practice. Teachers can listen to recordings of their students' readings at any time through Reading Assistant's review feature. Assessments and detailed reports allow them to easily track students' progress and quickly identify those who need additional help. The software also generates district-level reports that help administrators ensure every school is using the program effectively. Reading Assistant is a highly efficient and cost-effective way to build reading fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary, and provide real literacy support for every student. And Michael? In just 6 months of using Reading Assistant, combined with his teacher's existing classroom instruction, his reading grade level has increased 50% more than that of students receiving classroom instruction alone. Try a free demo today to find out what Reading Assistant can do for your students.
So that's just a short introduction on Reading Assistant. So if you're interested in any of the programs like I mentioned, please do indicate on the feedback form, and we'll be quite happy to come and do a demonstration for you. So thank you very much for your attendance again this afternoon. We hope that you will find it to be meaningful, and thank you again to Dr. Burns, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.
Thank you. I would love to come to Singapore anytime. You know who else is here? Paul Simon is here in a minute.